I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Taffy Brodesser-Akner. Oh, so looking forward to this conversation. Yeah, Fleishman is in Trouble was a force of nature in the summer of 2019. It was the book of the summer. It was so many things. But Long Island Compromise. Okay, we are spoiler-free in this conversation because so much happens in this book, and I love these characters, even the ones that drove me around the bend. I am so excited for this conversation. It's like the great American novel. It's like Philip Roth. It's John Updike. It's a little Great Gatsby. I will totally go there. It is a little Great Gatsby in its aspiration.
I'll take it.
Yeah,
I'll
right?
take it.
But this family, the Fletchers.
Yes.
Oh, man, the Fletchers. Where did they come from?
The Fletchers are, it's funny, not many people, first of all, Miwa, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big fan, and I'm a big Barnes & Noble fan. And I will say that you are coming to me from the Barnes & Noble that I used to spend all my time. My dorm was on Union Square West, and I sat in while my roommate had her boyfriend over. I sat in that Barnes & Noble. So it's very, very, very close to my heart. Where did they come from? It's funny. This was the first book I tried writing. And when it didn't work out. And then a friend of mine told me he was getting a divorce. And I realized that a million other people had told me they were getting a divorce. And I thought maybe it'll just be easier to write something that's more like a magazine story I would have written. So I went off and I wrote Fleishman, and then I returned to this. And what's so funny about it is that in Fleishman, you could see this sort of thumbprints of all the stories I heard. Mm-hmm. Whereas these people are so wholly of my perverted, terrible imagination that, and also my fantasy about what it must be like to be rich, and also some observation from the many, 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 many wealthy people I have interacted with in my life, that I don't know where they came from, but I know that I think birth order, things like that are so ingrained in us that when they came out whole.
Right.
And also like traumatized people, and also post-war Jews. And also I have come to dispute the notion that all happy families are the same. I think it's actually all miserable families are the same. Okay. It's that Tolstoy thing. People would say that about couples too. And actually, when I was writing Fleishman, every divorce I heard about was exactly the same. And every sort of post-war traumatized family I've heard about. And as this book is coming out and people call me up or they write to me and they say, this is my family, I guess, where did they come from? Well, they're everywhere. All it would take, all someone needed to do is catch them in a jar.
And I can't agree more. I mean, I grew up outside of Boston. I'm like, oh, I recognize all of these people.
Where outside of Boston? Is it Brookline?
No. It's South Shore. Duper. I mean, South Shore, but like there is that sort of old school sensibility. Like, I'm really not kidding when I was just like, oh, there's a lot of Updike happening in the background here. And there's a lot of Roth happening and a little bit of Cheever. But that whole sort of, mid-century American, like, here's all of this promise. We're supposed to be, the city on the hill, all that kind of stuff. And wow, you think money is going to solve, and I'm using you in the grand sort of scheme of things, right? Like,
yeah, but I also me.
But okay, also you, but like money, money doesn't fix everything for the Fletchers. I'm thinking specifically of Nathan and Beamer. Sorry.
Right. Or any
when I think of his name. And Jenny, like, I mean, Carl, we're going to get to Carl and Ruth in a second, but I sort of want to start with our middle-age cast of siblings because they're great. They're messy. They're weird. They're our peers. Your peer, my peer.
We know them. We work with them.
And I mean, money makes them a little spastic. It doesn't it makes it easier in some ways, sure. Like, you don't have to think about where you're going to live or things like that. But I would not say these kids are roaring successes of their lives.
The questions of money in the book came from this. I did not grow up with money. I grew up very confused because it seemed like we like trafficked in people with money, right, but we didn't have any ourselves. And my father is from a very fancy part of Long Island. We lived there for a few years until my parents got divorced and we moved to a very poor part of Brooklyn. And when I was the thing I was writing was born of this question I had, which was, I was a journalist. I was successful as a journalist. And I could not understand how I could be so successful and not also have money. Like, how did I not get money? I was still laboring under the questions and the promises of an earlier version of the American dream, when clearly I was headed right to where we are now, which is the gig economy. And those were the questions I had. And so the book asks these questions. Can money ever buy you happiness? But can it ever buy you safety? So it starts with this kidnapping, right? A kidnapping that is born of, how much money they have. He's kidnapped because he's so rich. Right. But then he's returned because they had enough money to pay the ransom. So money, which is it? Is it this provider of safety or is it this provider of danger? And I don't think you come away from this book, unless I'm wrong, knowing the answer to that, except that it's still a very prevalent question. It's an unanswerable question.
I love the fact that it's an unanswerable question, though, because I think, and especially when you look at things like, okay, Succession, delighted that some of the chatter has died down about, I might have been the only person in New York not watching Succession, though I followed the coverage.
Have you since?
So I watched a couple of episodes and I was like, peace out, I'm good, thanks. I just
really?
I'm
love Succession.
Raised by wolves. I totally raised by wolves. I tried Billions too, and I was like, Now, if you want to talk about the Fast and the Furious, that's a conversation I can have, but it doesn't quite work in with Fleishman. No, you know what? I have the movie taste of a 12-year-old boy.
Sure,
that's really what it comes down to.
That's good.
But if you look at all of the conversations that we're having as a culture, right, around money and billionaires, and certainly the power that goes with money, right? And who's allowed to behave in what way, because they can frankly just buy their way out of it. But you've set this book in the 80s, really. Like, the start of everything is in the 80s. And when you think of where we were as America in the 80s and where we are now, it's like, it's not just a generation. It's like the radical amount of change that's come, whether it's been from tech. I mean, this is a family that owns a factory, which, at the moment that the family establishes themselves, like, moving to Long Island is a big deal. This is their true moment of success. They have arrived, et cetera. They own this factory and all of the means of production. And then the world changes around them.
Right. I mean, I did not know when I was in like my 8th grade social studies class, and my teacher would talk about the way the economy changed, that I could possibly witness this in my lifetime, right? That I could graduate from college into the best economy this country has ever seen, the best opportunity. And now I used to teach a journalism class, and I don't even know if in good conscience I should be taking money from people to learn something where there's so little opportunity. And that's what happened. We're at the late capitalism of everything. And who knew that one of the casualties of all this money and all this class divide, to the point where the middle class is gone, who knew that the casualties of it would be good ideas, ingenuity, creativity, compassion, generosity? Like, who knew that this is where we would arrive? I certainly didn't. I wrote this as a journalist as much as I wrote it as a novelist. And I remember the day, I think was I on tour for my last book when I read Thomas Piketty, when I read Capital. And I read it the way, other people cry at For Whom the Bell Tolls. It suddenly dawned on me, this was over. That this was like, I don't even know if we can rescue it. And the problem seems to be that the people a generation ahead of you don't believe it. Similarly to the way that, I'm squarely Generation X. I'm 48 years old. And the way people where I work complain about the younger people, how they don't work so hard. And you think, why would they work hard? We fell for it because we were told we'd get rich working.
Mm-hmm.
We believed it because we'd seen our parents' generation actually have it. But these people don't stand a chance. Why should they not be into all sorts of Baroque skincare regimens when we can promise them nothing? We're expecting them to work for a meager wage with no promise that things are going to get any better. And the only way I had to talk about that was through the lens of like a bunch of rich kids.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm just going back to Nathan and Beamer and Jenny again. I mean, they do have their own lives, and the way you sort of approach it with that sort of very witty POV that you have. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing thinking about this book and thinking about these. But they super do not have their lives sorted out, right? Like they're supposed to, they believe, right? They believe that at X, Y, and Z point in their lives, they're supposed to know that they were given a handbook, to life based on their sort of parents' experience and their grandparents' experience and all of that kind of thing, right? And it's not just like which fork to use. That's not what we're talking about, but like measures of success and where you're supposed to be in your career. And you just peel it all back. And this is part of the fun of the book, right? As we learn about these guys and they think, and I'm throwing Jenny in there too, but as they sort of reveal themselves, right, that they're caught up in this story and they don't understand quite how their father's experience in his kidnapping has formed them. They actually believe that they are simply who they are because they're in the world and they have their lives and their jobs and their relationships and in some cases marriages and children and all of that kind of thing. And watching, I don't want to say it's a magic trick watching you reveal all of this stuff, but you have clearly been paying attention to the world in a way that maybe the rest of us, and I'm also Gen X, have maybe possibly not been paying attention quite the same way. And it's like sort of feeling like you're eavesdropping on a cocktail party, right? Like my parents used to throw these ridiculous parties back in the day. And I loved nothing more than sitting at the top of the steps and being like, what are the adults doing? Like, how do I get into that mix? As a tiny person with pigtails and pajamas. And of course, they're just like, yes, please go back upstairs. We are so not interested in what the children have to say.
Right.
But I mean, you just have this ear for dialogue. And I know, I mean, I've read the profiles. I've read a lot of your work prior to both of the books, but I just feel like you've been taking notes on all of us for a really long time. And not just the people with money, but like we hit a lot of different kinds of folks granted, they're all sort of orbiting the Fletchers.
Right.
Okay. And the Burbank psychic. But can we talk about constructing a world, right? Like I get that there are all of these ideas that are rushing in, but you still have to humanize everything.
You still have to tell a story is what you have to do. You have to these characters existed for me, and the themes about money existed for me. And also the question to land on, which is you spend your whole young adulthood leaving your home and trying to not to define yourself against your family, but to show how different you were from them the whole time. Only to come to middle age, find that you make sense to nobody except for your family. Even the family you constructed, even your best friends, even the people that you chose and seem to understand you the most, even the ones you gave birth to. You come to find that there is nobody that you make sense to except for your family. And that's when you return to them. That's when you start to appreciate them.
I'm thinking about how all of the Fletchers sort of ping pong into each other, right? Like, yeah. I mean, that's the fun of this. I mean, it's the fun of the story. There is some, there's some serious stuff, but the idea that we can laugh at ourselves, right? I mean, essentially, the Fletchers are, the rest of us too.
Yes, we are all the Fletchers.
But looking at them and just seeing how they're trying to make sense of their own worlds, right?
Right.
And watching the collision, though. I mean, it's kind of amazing what you do and how you do it, because none of it feels forced. And I mean, you pull off some, I don't want to make it sound like it's stunts, but there are some set pieces, obviously. But there are a couple of different revelations, and I mentioned one of them to you before we started taping, obviously. Right. I was yelling when I got to that.
I'm glad to hear that.
It was perfect, but I didn't know it was coming. So to be able to still be surprised, right, in this kind of epic American story, right, and you think, like, here's this very sort of overbearing grandma, and then we've got Carl, who obviously has been impacted by his kidnapping, and then his wife Ruth, who seems very much a woman of her time.
Yes, very.
And her play, like, everyone's sort of like, I've met Phyllis's in my world, right?
Sure.
Like, there are some folks of a certain age and a certain bearing, and they just are who they are, and you adapt. Right? Like, you adapt when you're in
but everyone everyone is launched from their circumstances. Ruth grew up poor, made a devil's bargain and married this guy, and then he was kidnapped, and she felt like it was God's punishment. And so God's punishment was like, what she had to do is repent, and what she does is she takes care of him to the exclusion of the children, and then wakes up to find that her children, when she got married, when she first became Mrs. Fletcher, which was someone who was going to have a lot of money for the rest of her life, she thought, this is a gift I am giving my unborn children. And then she looks at the children she actually has and realizes, wait, these kids aren't these kids aren't my children. These are rich kids. Like, was there a way to have children who could appreciate what I've given them and not rich kids? And the answer was, in this case, no. The hardest part of this book, I will tell you, and I am not exaggerating, that there were 9 drafts of this book. And I don't mean revisions. I mean completely rewritten. I'm a magazine writer, and I'm a very fast writer. I could not get it right. And it was only when I finally got the story right, which is the Fletchers lose their money. And what happens to them then? Who are they without money? That then you have a beginning and a middle and an end. But because it's an epic novel, as you say, like, it's a family epic, you're not expecting anything to be solved in it, right? You're not expecting new information to come in, because in this kind of book, that doesn't usually happen. And to play with your understanding of the genre that you're in, like, part of late capitalism is also a postmodernism, where you play with the thing that people will see. They hold up this book and they know, it's funny. I was just talking weirdly today with Harlan Coben about his book covers. We were talking about book covers, and he was like, yeah, this is what sells this kind of book. And I thought about that. Like, there was a version of a cover for Long Island Compromise that was a 1970s car that was sort of beaten up, and you could as you read it, you would know that this was the car that he was taken away in. But everyone at Random House said, you can't have this book. Like, people will think this is a crime novel. And I was like, this isn't a crime novel. But again, you're at a bookstore. It is so important to be able to convey to a reader what they're reading. But then it becomes fun to sort of cross those. Is it obscene to say cross those streams and mix things together and say, I was very lucky to interview Jonathan Franzen a few years ago, and he said to me, no matter, something to the effect of, no matter how literary your novel, it is always good to avail yourself of great storytelling tools that are time honored and that always work. A cliffhanger, a mystery, those things.
I'm also just looking over, I have your galley on the desk in front of me, and I also have repackages of a couple of Philip Roth novels. And obviously, Philip Roth of
Show
all
them
of
to me.
Well, they're very pink.
I bet.
Which is not, like, my original copy of this was bright yellow, right? And that...
Wow.
Like, okay.
I know.
Wait for American Pastoral.
Is so interesting.
It's like, okay.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Then,
that is a choice.
And it's Zuckerman is lavender.
It's lavender. That is not even pink, by the way. That was hot pink.
Yeah.
That is a really interesting choice.
I went back and forth on Roth for a really long time because, you know, Roth maybe not always so great with his female characters, like straight up. Like, dude.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, I hadn't
dude.
heard that. I hadn't thought that.
No, right? I know. Just such a random thought. It's kind of like having people walk into your office and say, so Fleischman's a novel about this dude, right? And so you haven't gotten to the end, huh?
I started reading Roth so young that I am embarrassed to say how old I was before I understood that it wasn't just that, like, his male characters kept getting involved with these terrible women. That's what I thought. I was like, gosh, these guys, they find the worst women. And then you realize.
Yeah, then you realize.
But you know what? I didn't have a choice. The way you just talked about, I didn't really have a choice about getting into Roth or going back and forth about him. A little bit the way I didn't have a choice about Woody Allen. Like, there were so few people representing the very specific place I come from that I would forgive a lot. Not everything, you know. And my thinking has evolved on that since then. But I would not throw away a novel because of the novelist's own sins, because it was so good to be seen. It made me understand that argument so well. Like, what are we, you know, we're missing a lot of different voices, and those voices are so important because you can read for a lot of reasons, but one of them is inevitably to be understood.
I mean, Amy Tan is an OG in my book, right? She changed the landscape for a lot of folks. I mean, not that Maxine Hung Kingston wasn't doing the work as well, but there's a different moment, right, when you see Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale on the shelf next to Amy Tan in a classmate's mom's living room. You know, like, that's when you're kind of like, okay,
totally true. But I remember people like Gentiles telling me how much they loved Roth, and me not really understanding what it like. Oh, that's interesting. You must read everything, as opposed to this is a great storyteller. Erica Jong too. Like, Erica Jong, you know, if you look at Fear of Flying is a very basic story. It's a very basic sort of like medium romantic comedy, but what it meant, how it existed for women, how it existed for a certain kind of Jewish New York woman to finally be someone speaking for you. That was an amazing moment.
I mean, when I was a kid, I remember people's parents reading a lot of Le Carré, a lot of Updike, a lot of Cheever. But the parents who were serious readers had Roth there as well. They had Woolf there as well. Like, you know, it went a little beyond the bestseller list. Like, you saw Michener everywhere, right? Like,
everywhere.
My parents had a lot of Michener in the house too. Like, but then you get to a point where you're like, oh, hey, wait a minute. Like, or Saul Bellow. Like, Saul Bellow for the longest time was also kind of like, oh.
Yeah.
You know, that adult in your household is a very, very serious reader. When you see Mark Twain and Jack London, you're like, oh, you have a dad.
Oh, yeah. Or like, oh, you too were in 9th grade.
Okay. I will defend East of Eden by Steinbeck, though. That is actually a great American novel, but
oh my gosh,
the whole different conversation to have.
I've never read it, and I'm reading it next. It's on my next list. I'm so excited for it.
I actually convinced one of my cousins to read it recently. I was like, no, really, it holds. And again, Steinbeck, you know, problematic dude, but East of Eden holds. It really does.
Among Us is not problematic.
You know, I think that's part of the whole human condition. But again, the Fletcher family.
Okay, we could go back
right?
to the book. Yeah,
We
I just
need
love
to go
talking
back to the
books.
Fletchers for a second.
Just
Yeah,
talking about
no, because
books with you.
I'm also really just kind of excited to see people come to this, because obviously, right, like you've been reading and writing for a really long time. We all bring our own stuff, right? Every one of us brings where we are, who we are to whatever we read. And I'm really kind of excited to see how people respond, because again, to me, the Fletchers, like, yeah, there are two ways to read it, right? Like, there's the whole Long Island Jewish American family thing. And then for me, it's like, well, that's not my experience. And yet I recognize who all of these people are.
Right.
Like, I get them and I understand, like, Beamer. Oh, Beamer. Oh, Beamer, get your stuff together. I mean, Beamer may have some issues that need to be addressed in lots of different ways, some of which involve substances. And it's like, well, I mean, that's not because he's from Long Island.
No, that just happened online. And
Beamer.
That's where he was when it happened.
But like when he's talking to his mother about who he's asked to marry him, and he's having that one-sided conversation where clearly his mother is saying all of the things that she wants to be heard. And he's like, yes. Yeah, because his soon-to-be wife is sitting in the room with him, and he's like, yeah, she can't wait to meet you either. Yeah, wasn't your dad also called Wolf? I mean, that's the kind of stuff, though, that translation between generations, right? Like,
it's not just generations. It's anyone who ever felt like, why can't my family just be normal?
Right.
And you always think that the other people, you know, in that first scene where he proposes to Noelle, his non-Jewish girlfriend, and Noelle calls her family, and they're over the moon. And she says, let's call your family. And he, with dread, picks up the phone and he tells her, and his mother starts yelling at him. And he's like, she can't wait either. Oh, she can't wait to meet you. And they, you know, and the mother is saying, you know, your grandfather hid on a ship out of Poland so that you would have a better life. And this is not like, everyone thinks their family is the worst. If my family is listening to this, I do not. I think we're medium fine.
I have some stories. I have some stories that parts of my family are like, oh yeah, we should tell those. And parts of my family are like, that just didn't happen. I'm like, no, I've seen the cue in the box.
You had a memory hole in your family.
You can tell me that version, but I'm pretty sure you're leaving.
I was there. That's the worst thing about your children, is that they are witness to any future effort you make to remarket what happened here.
It's not that Long Island Compromise is a page turner, because that's a phrase that does a lot of lifting in a lot of ways, some of which might not be accurate.
Though.
But it's fun and it's fast and it moves. No, it really moves. Like every piece of the action and the dialogue constantly moving the story forward. And I think I didn't realize until recently that you had studied screenwriting. And now that I know that, I'm kind of like, oh, there's some of the scaffolding, there's some of the structure, even for the magazine pieces, where I'm just like, oh, you really know how to push stuff forward.
What I know is that once you are telling a story, that the only thing you should tell is that story. That even if you got on tangents, everything has to be about the story. That's what you learn like a ruthless efficiency in screenwriting, that because there's a page count, I mean, it's brutal. It is at page 50, this has to happen. At page 10, this has to happen. And I found that in my magazine stories, if I knew what they were about, and I told them the way you would tell a story in a movie, then they would be more entertaining and the reader would feel more cared for. And that translated very easily. This book at one point was about 800 pages. And it's not anymore buying public.
No. It's 424 very tight pages.
Yes. And by the way, when I was struggling with this book, it was a screenwriter, Susanna Grant, who said that to me. Go through it and just cut everything that isn't there to serve the story. Even if you love it, just cut it. And I got rid of 100 pages that way. It was amazing. Screenwriters are the only people, like, if you ever have a problem with writing, you should read a screenplay or ask a screenwriter.
Well, also, editing is not the problem. I mean, I talk to a lot of writers, obviously, and sometimes the writing comes down to rewriting, right? And even if you're doing
Yes.
small stuff like even copy and whatnot, there are times where you look at a piece of copy and you're like, yeah, that whiffs. That just is not going to be the thing. Or a piece of copy that looks fine online that doesn't necessarily translate to a shelf talker on a
Right.
like, you just have to play with this stuff. But
Right.
yeah, usually fewer words is better.
Fewer words is better. And also someone told me once that from the time an audience engages with you as a writer, be it a play, a screenplay, a novel, they just want to know when it's over. And I actually do you remember when ebooks came out and
Oh, yes.
it was like 80% ebooks or something? And then it quickly fell off. And I think that even though you can see the percentage on your reader, it's actually having the book in your hand. How much do I have left? Which is the most reassuring thing. Like, I want to have inhaled this. Like, my experience of walking through a Barnes and Noble is I want to consume this, not I want to stay with it for a long time.
When I prep for the show, I need paper. I mean, I can read anything electronically, and certainly there are times too when you're on a plane and like that's just the easiest way to get through something really quickly. Or you just need to get a feel, whatever. I mean, I will read across format. It doesn't, and audiobooks are hugely helpful if I'm rereading something, unless the narrator is really distracting.
Right.
With all respect, sometimes that happens, but mostly it's great. But in terms of prep, I mean, I dog ear, I write all over stuff. I'm kind of notorious for destroying galleys because the whole point is to interact with whatever's happening in front of you. Right. Like, you have taken the time to make this whole world of the Fletchers and the town they live in. And I love these people. They are just, they're kind of completely bonkers, and yet they're just very alive. And it would be kind of easy. I suspect there are going to be some people who come to it and maybe won't have the warm feelings I have about all of the family. And there are some moments where you're like, wow, you said that. Okay. I think people are who they are, right? Like, we don't walk through the world. We can hope that people change and people become something else. But that's the beauty of a novel. Like, we're sitting in the interiority of people who are like, oh, wow.
You know, that's what I think about sometimes when I read a few reviews of Fleishman, sort of user reviews, like on Goodreads or and of this book too, of, you know, are any of these people likable? And it's like, not liking a book because someone said, like, are any of these people redheaded? Like, that is not a useful metric for me. It feels to me a metric only applied to books with a woman's name on the cover. But also, like, everyone I know is likable. You're likable. Like, I think you and I should hang out. But that's not what I'm reading for. I'm not reading for pleasantness. If I wanted pleasantness, I'd go take a walk in the park. When I am reading, it is to understand what people are and who they are, and to say something about humanity and the human condition and people that is true. Because I never feel better than when something is true, when I hear something true.
I mean, I read to blow up my world, right? Likable is just not a criteria I use. Likable for me, and also, like, I don't finish books all the time.
But then why do people care about that? Like, you have such experience with readers. You know, I remember that the first time I published a book, we sent galleys, you know, you send them to all of these readers, you send these net galleys to people. And it was at the time where I was we were considering covers, and there was this question: do you want everyone to buy this and read it? And the answer is, like, not the people who don't want it.
Right.
And, you know, the reason book covers work so well, and the reason those people are geniuses, marketing people especially, and book designers, are because they know what they are trying to say to somebody with a book cover. And I thought, like, why would we try to sell this to people? It'll just make them angry.
Right.
And I feel like very lucky that I have a publishing house and an editor that want me to be me. And I feel like when I was writing magazine profiles, people would always say to me, well, did you like him? Did you like her? And that's not, what kind of question is that? Like, what kind of metric, arbitrary metric is that?
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't know what I like and you don't know what I find likable. You know, I mean, maybe people would find me detestable in real life. I don't know. But I know that it would be that to have a real conversation is so much easier than to have a plucky one. That's what I imagine in likable literature, pluckiness.
Yeah, when 9-year-olds sound like 40-year-olds, I'm just like, thanks. I also, I don't do talking animals.
Oh yeah,
with a few exceptions. Well, I shouldn't say that. Open throat, actually, true story. I had said to the publisher and the editor, I was like, I don't do talking animals.
Such a weird thing for people to know you don't do.
Yeah, I've been in the book business for a long time.
Yeah,
and the voice was so great. I mean, Henry Hoke does a thing in that open throat novel, and it's 152 super tight pages.
Wow.
Narrated by a talking mountain lion, and I was in from the first sentence.
Oh my God, I'm writing it down.
Given the way you do dialogue and the way you do he does a thing in super tight pages, also not a lot of punctuation, if I remember correctly. Yeah, no, also his publisher and his editor are free to make fun of me for that. Tucked it in my bag, read it on a flight, and I was just like, oh.
Wow.
Oh, I'm so wrong. So, yeah, we all have our thing. But I left Long Island Compromise feeling like I had experienced something in a world that was familiar enough, but pushed me. Like, I wasn't sure how I felt about Nathan sort of going into it, and then you give us that whole storyline that we get, and I'm like, oh, that poor dude. And suddenly I'm like, huh.
I mean, it is always true. It is always true that the more time you spend with someone, the more you understand them and the more you love them and the more you see yourself in them. That's how we're built. We're evolved to stay in a pack. We're evolved to like each other.
But again, this brings us back to likability, right? I'm like, I was not expecting to necessarily connect.
I don't mean like this way. I mean love.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's fair.
I mean that, yeah.
I just want to leave a book slightly changed. Like, I don't need to have a massive evolution of myself when I finish a book, but I want to know that something shifted.
Me too.
That I was surprised. Exactly. And I read so much that it's like when I have the chance to be surprised, it sticks.
What surprised you most about this?
There's some plot points that we're not going to talk about. It was a lot of that kind of detail level stuff where I'm like, oh, because when you get the details right, and by that I mean timing, I also mean sort of the person delivering the thing that happens. I think the overall narrative voice really worked for me. It's that sort of wry step back thing that you do. I mean, it's one thing to have Libby sort of narrating Fleishman, and that's a different experience, but this is a much more sort of omniscient kind of wink, wink, nod. And it just really works for this book. And again, I knew this was your second novel. I knew there was a family and we were on Long Island. And I was like, okay, let's go. And I read it so quickly. Wow. And I do read fast, but like, I think I put it down a couple of times because, sleep.
Yeah, sure.
Office, little
hundreds
things.
Of pages.
But if I'd had my druthers, I read really quickly. If I'd had my druthers, I would have done it sort of over a weekend kind of thing instead of doling it out because I just needed to know where we were going. And, we meet Carl's sister who's, Marjorie.
Oh, Marjorie's my favorite. Marjorie's the best. Can I ask you about reading fast? Did you always read fast?
Yeah, so I was that kid. Do you remember SRA cards? Am I dating myself really badly?
I mean, I think, are we the same age?
We're close. We're really close. So it was this, in first grade, there was this box of color-coded cards, and it was reading comprehension stuff. And so they would just be like, hey, you kids, go over there during quiet time. And everyone sort of worked at their own pace because, 70s.
Yeah.
I finished the box too quickly, and they were like, "What do we do with you?" And it was like 12 steps or so. You were supposed to do like a color a month, and I was like, "Hi."
So I write like that. I write in a sort of disturbing fast way, but I read. The only proof I have that I do not have some sort of like, I think I can write faster than I can read. And it really bums me. I'm always looking for a way to figure out if I could learn how to read faster.
I mean, I've heard of people teaching themselves to speed read. I'm sure it's possible. I mean, also, I've always loved history. So, like, even in high school, I was doing a lot of history. And then I got to college and I was doing a lot of it. You just kind of have to, if you're going to survive, you kind of just have to learn. But I've also been in the book business for a really, really long time. And you just kind of learn where you can read around stuff. Yeah. I mean, there are times where you just have to read something on a deadline. And
I know that.
You're right. Yeah. And you just get it done and you're like, okay, here's the thing that pings. But part of the fun of doing something like this, right, doing Poured Over, is having the context. And I mean, I have a really long runway for sort of contemporary American fiction. And there was all the stuff that I read when I was younger just because I was trying to figure out the world, right? All of the Baldwin and the Morrison and, you know, Maxine Hong Kingston and just lots of great stuff. And also, you know, V.C. Andrews. Like, I'm not going to pretend. Like, I just read everything. Right? Like, I mean, I was the kid who just read everything.
V.C. Andrews, man, could not put those down.
Passed them around in grade school.
Oh my God.
We were raised by wolves.
We were just, can you believe what we were reading? The dirtiest, like, I cannot. It's a great book.
Michael Korda.
Oh my God.
And our parents just had, you know, and you're just wandering around going, okay.
They're like, at least they're not watching TV.
Yeah, that actually is
because we don't care about our children.
No, at one point my mother actually had to get a black and white TV because she couldn't get a babysitter because we didn't have a TV, and she was like, "This doesn't work." But it lived in her bedroom closet when there was no babysitter on the premises.
Funny, wow.
Yeah, she was very big on that, very, very big on the you can, and I'm just like, okay. And then I had an uncle who was a librarian who just kind of like, okay, kid, go read.
Right.
You know, but the world opens up, and that's the thing. And that's part of what I love so much about Long Island Compromise is, again, like, not my world specifically, right? But enough of it because of the humanity and because of the story and because of the stuff that you do, where it's just like, oh yeah, I know who these people are. Yep, I know. That maybe some of the details are different, but like, again, that's why I read so I can get sort of a view of the world, right? Like, we should be able to connect on a human level.
Right.
With someone else's story and just be like, oh yeah, I know what that feels like. Like the emotional truth and the emotional landscape of Long Island Compromise. I mean, it's really wry. It's really smart. It's really a little ruthless, but not mean. You're just like, oh, by the way, here's one other thing that I noticed that no one else is noticing. And it feels really real. I couldn't not engage with what was happening. And yeah, I got a bunch of laughs out of it. And I got some surprises out of it. And I really didn't want it to end.
Wow.
That's so and you can sort of see this American landscape in there too. And again, I know I keep going back to Roth and Updike, but there is this sort of sensibility that goes with the American century, right? Like the sort of moving through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then the 80s. And then suddenly, like, change just accelerates, right? Like, I don't know, like late 90s, I guess, let's call it. Like the late 90s, everything sort of starts to move at a pace.
I mean, it does, but that's because of our age, that like we stop experiencing time so slowly. But then what actually happens, who is it? Ray Kurzweil talks about how once technology changes, it doesn't go from radio to television to internet. Like once it takes off, it goes exponential. And that's why time feels so crazy. But also because we're older. Like my younger son said to me, I said, let's go to the park. Let's ride our bikes in the park. It's such a nice day. He said, grownups are always talking about what a nice day it is. And it's so true. The reason we talk about it is because we know how fleeting the summer is, but it's not for them. it's really a long period of time for them because they don't have that much time in their experience. It is a big chunk of their lives. And you and I, it's just another summer. It'll be like you and I probably have things in our calendars that are in September.
Oh, I'm not going to tell you what the rest of my calendar looks like. There's some stuff on my calendar where I'm like, and you're about to be on book tour and like,
oh my God, my calendar is like I sent my tour card to somebody today and she said, well, I hope you're getting a massage on this one day you don't have an event. And I was like, what? I'm traveling and doing 19 interviews that day. It's crazy. Very lucky to have a book tour. I know.
Oh, I don't think anyone is hearing complaints about that. It's just reality, right? It is just simply where we live and how we live. I mean, I'm already trying to figure out sort of tapings into the fall and all of that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Okay, and how do I leave a little bit of space just in case things drop in? Like you don't want to it's walking that line of how do I plan, but also keep space for the unexpected, right? Because that's essentially what book selling is. It's like, well, how do you do the thing that's right in front of you, but also figure out what's possibly coming down the pipe?
Right. And how do you pivot to, to when something's successful? It's a very interesting business.
It's fun. It's really, honestly, it's really fun. And it's really, I'm quite fond of all of this stuff.
Yeah, you're lucky. Booksellers are the greatest people in the world. And it is quite profound to me how much learning about their lives and their points of view through publishing a book, and how important, like, I could cry at the stories that booksellers have told me about how important books are to them, and how to just want to be like, I can't tell you what that means to someone like me who writes, especially now when you feel like you are spitting into the wind with any publication. A magazine story in the New York Times does not have people's attention. It's really wonderful. So thank you. Thank you.
But also coming back to story, right? Like we get to surround ourselves by stories. And that, like, keep thinking about something that Holly Hughes said years ago, which is telling stories was truly the first human thing we ever did. And I'm like, yeah, pretty much. And then we get this huge variety, right? And like how to keep that variety happening. So, yeah, of course, we're bumping up against time, but trauma also is a piece of this book. And I don't want to step away from that because, again, like Beamer and Nathan and Jenny and Ruth, everyone in this book is who they are because there is a piece of trauma, whether it's a global scale or whether it's just much more family oriented. But I don't really want to lose sight of that. I know I've been punching up like, this is fun, this is interesting. Yes, it is.
No, I know. It's, life is trauma and life is funny. But when you talk about how the first human thing we do is tell stories, I often think, like, what is it, like, why do we do that? And do we do it to relate to each other? Do we do it to find compassion for each other? I think we do it to make sense of what has happened to us. Like the times in my life, I cannot stop telling a story over and over and over because something went very wrong. And and actually now they have a therapy for it. Like EMDR is supposed to be just repeating the story over and over and processing it. And that's what we have. Like, I know, we talked a lot about why we read, but that's also why we write.
Yeah. And I'm really, really glad you write, whether it's the magazine pieces.
I'm so glad you read.
Oh, there's a whole nother conversation, though, for us to have about divorce and write-arounds, because also you do a write-around the way Patrick Radden Keefe does a write-around. I love a write-around.
I love
don't know what I'm talking about. Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. It's this legendary magazine piece.
It's writing a story without access to your subject.
There are times, too, I feel for you, because there are a couple of pieces where and I'm just like, yeah, I know that person's sitting in front of you, but they have decided you do not have access.
Yes, they've decided. They are sitting there, but that's not the same as access. Yeah, totally.
But being able to capture the essence of the story, right? And the human that goes with it, I think is it's really fun to read you. It is really, even when you're sort of digging in on the tough stuff, it is really really fun to read you. So Taffy, thank you so
Miwa,
much.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Barnes & Noble for your wonderful support. I really appreciate it.
And Long Island Compromise is out now, and I hope everyone spends the summer with this book because it is really good. It is really, really good.
Oh, thank you. Yes, everyone read it, please.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.